the deep state. What is it that's going on there?
The incentives to do the worst possible thing are overwhelming. And
what?
The U.S. worked with Noriega. The U.S. worked with Saddam Hussein. The U.S. worked with the bin Laden family. There's no such thing as an extremist group in that sense. It's, are you useful or not?
Are we on the brink of World War III?
They'll want world peace when they're totally in charge of the world. Until then, it's war. They have effectively ended the First Amendment in my country. They work with YouTube. They work with Facebook. They work with Twitter. That is government control of the information ecosystem. This is the same thing our State Department passed sanctions on North Korea for doing. The fact that there is free speech on X, it's like a hole in the Titanic. It's very hard to contain. If you have 600 million people who can talk about something, that's absolutely huge.
Do you not think America should have supported Ukraine in the war?
I cannot entertain, while the gun is still to my head and to all of my friends' heads, my colleagues' heads, and half of Congress's heads.
It's a bleak picture that you paint.
It's a delicate tango dance, but it's going to be a hell of a movie.
Hello and welcome to the Winston Marshall Show with me, Winston Marshall. I sat down with former State Department official Mike Benz. We discussed the mechanisms behind the counter-populism movement. We discussed America's foreign policy, the difference between that of Biden, Blinken, and Trump. We talked about the deep state. What is really going on? This was quite an exceptional conversation, not one I've had before on this show. We went extremely deep. Special attention to what is happening in Ukraine, Russia. Are we on the brink of World War III? What happened in 2014? How does this all link together? Mike has done exceptional work exposing the censorship industrial complex. He's done exceptional work exposing the quote-unquote blob, the American State Department and all its tentacles. All of that and a lot more. But before you hear from Mike, I ask if you want to support the show. All you need to do is press subscribe. If you press subscribe, I can have more phenomenal guests like Mike Benz discussing the issues you want to hear about. But without further ado, here he is, Mike Benz. Mike, great to speak with you.
You too.
I want to understand about your time in the State Department because, you've come out as very much anti the blob. The blob, as I've understood it in your terms, is the State Department, it's the CIA, it's the foreign or overseas facing aspect of the American, would you say deep state or state? Just the state, I guess.
The empire.
The empire. What do you mean by the empire?
Well, what I mean is America is comprised of two components. There's the American homeland, which is where U.S. citizens live. And there's the American empire, which are all of our sort of political vassal states, all of our natural resource havens, all of our export markets for our U.S. companies, all of our sourcing for critical supply lines, all of our trade partners. And the argument at the outset of the American empire, we can sort of trace the lineage of all this from the 1800s to present, but effectively, the United States, our national security state, our deep state, if you will, has had this compact with the American people since the end of World War II that they would have a license to do dirty things abroad. They would call it internally the Department of Dirty Tricks back in the 40s and 50s. This ability to go out and do things in the rest of the world that would effectively create a prosperous American empire, but it would redound to the benefit of the citizens of the U.S. homeland. Because if we, for example, want cheap gas prices, well, you're going to need to source that gas. And before the fracking revolution, for example, in the early 2000s, which is fraught with its own concerns, most of American oil came from Mexico and Canada and South America and Saudi Arabia and places like. Well, what happens if there is a political leadership in that country that decides to nationalize the oil or cut off U.S. access or partnerships? We need a mechanism to be able to go in and overthrow that government or put pressure or leverage in order to allow us to exploit those natural resources. The same thing with trade and labor issues. The same thing with any number of every plot of dirt under our feet has some resource in it, whether that's copper or aluminum or fruit or sugar or oil or titanium. And your ability to extract that or to get favorable business terms is dependent on your ability to negotiate with the political leadership in charge of that territory. So we've needed this empire for the benefit of the homeland, but now we're in this place where there's a big conflict of interest between those two, because there's so much energy and so many secrets that need to be kept in order to maintain this empire. And it's coming at the cost of trillions of dollars of debt and hundreds of billions of dollars every year in foreign aid, so to speak, which is effectively bribery payments, in foreign regime change operations, which we simply call democracy promotion, in foreign militarism and the military industrial complex. And so at the same time, American institutions are failing. We are a second, almost third world country at this point in terms of our education and PISA scores. Our infrastructure is falling apart. Our cities look inferior to, even second world countries in many ways. And so there's now this moment that populism has stepped into.
I want to get into populism, to a thing, but I still want to hold back one moment. Well, firstly, you talk about this sense of protecting the empire. I immediately thought of the Opium Wars, because actually that's what the British military was sent in to protect trade interests of British companies, in that case trading tea and opium. So it's not unique to America that there's this sort of infrastructure that's been built there. But I still actually, before we get too deep into what's going on, I want to understand about your role in the State Department itself. I want to understand your story, because I also think that's helpful for listeners to get a bit of context, because it's quite remarkable that you would become from that and then come out and start very publicly criticizing it and taking it apart. Yeah. So I'd love to know what your involvement was with the Trump administration and the State Department.
Yeah. So, my technical title was Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Communications and Information Technology, which is, a long way of saying, it was just colloquially referred to as the cyber desk, is because it touched on cyber commerce effectively for the most part. There was a little bit of national security things related to that. I think, technically I oversaw 3 divisions at State, one relating to bilateral cyber policy, I think bilateral and regional, which is effectively, our information technology, diplomacy, one-on-one with other countries or as a regional bloc. The second one was multilateral affairs, which has to do with the U.S. participation in multilateral organizations like the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, which is, I think, the oldest multilateral organization in the world. It was created, I think, in the 1850s when countries had to communicate around, with each other around telegraphs and the sort of international regulation of early telegraph messaging. And then when subsea cables and all that, it became an international thing. Now that's sort of an internet policy forum. And then the third related to security and issues around China and certain great power competition issues. But from my perspective, the State Department was really the locus of the internet censorship story. And a lot of people didn't understand that and are only now really beginning to understand it. I did not understand it at first when I started off my journey in trying to write my great, sort of Bible of the entire censorship industry. At the time, I really looked at it as a domestic thing because we were experiencing censorship domestically. I thought, when you saw Trump supporters getting censored in the 2016 election, and, it was very easy to say, oh, there's a, pink-haired, ambigendered, BLM Hamas supporting person in the trust and safety team, and they pulled the lever, and you go, okay, this is just a culture war thing. This is just left versus right. This is a sort of, woke versus anti-woke. And I think that's the way most people have understood censorship up until quite recently. And that is the way for the first, I don't know, probably 2 years I was looking at it. But every time
whilst you were there.
Well, I'm saying from 2016 to 2018. But I came to the State Department with a knowledge of the State Department's huge role in internet censorship, and it was, my ambition to try to reform.
So why did they bring you in? Did you pretend that did you hide your opinions, or were you brought in because you had these opinions?
Well, I think it was because, I was a speechwriter primarily on technology and international affairs.
So you're already for Trump's speechwriter.
Yeah,
at
right,
that point.
Right.
How did that happen? How did you get to become his speechwriter?
Well, I was a technology lawyer. I knew the issues, inside and out. I knew people in the administration and had, been doing private briefings and things like that. People sort of knew me as the tech guy, and also the censorship guy. And they also knew me as the guy who was a bit of a zealot when it came to the role of the State Department in internet censorship at a time when a lot of people didn't even appreciate that censorship was happening. In 2020, for example, it was, very, there were still House hearings about whether censorship was even real and whether it was, even had a political bias or where it was coming from. And, these things were all denied, frankly, all the way up until Trump's deplatforming in 2021. And then it became a question not of whether it's real or not, but whether or not it's a good thing. It's like things, it's it's a conspiracy theory, it might be happening to it's happening and it's a good thing. That all happened over the course of several years. But I think that was something that I'd wanted to do. I'd wanted to be in a policy role.
So you got the job working for Trump as a speechwriter. Would we know any of the speeches you were involved in?
Yeah, I think I've talked about a few of them. For example, I think there were ones around free speech with the state attorney generals, and there's some sort of funny stories around that. I don't know how appropriate it is for me to talk about some of the inner minutia of the speechwriting office, in this setting. But there were a lot that technology was a really, really important part of Trump's economic engine. There was a really amazing moment where I think the Trump administration was aware of the threat that censorship posed, but not as aware as perhaps they should have been. But there was a real tension because Trump was campaigning on the economic record, the fact that there were more, job growth was was higher than it had ever been. The Dow and the S&P had broken all-time records. Famously, Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning New York Times columnist, had wrote when Trump on his campaign trail promised, I think, a 4% quarterly GDP growth, and Paul Krugman, I think, famously said that that'll happen when pigs fly and freeze over in hell simultaneously or something. It's basically saying it was completely impossible for it to happen. And then lo and behold, he hit the 4%. But a lot of that was powered by the technology companies. We lived through this transition in the past 10 years where big tech overtook big oil. In the 20th century and in the early 2000s, the largest companies in the world were ExxonMobil and Chevron and Gazprom in Russia. They were the oil and gas companies. And a lot of the story from the Industrial Revolution into the modern age was the story of big oil and the Rockefellers, who played such a big role in, the American prosperity story, you can argue. Mm-hmm. But then that all changed with the rise of Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon. And I say those companies in that order because the Trump campaign actually defined MAGA at the height of the censorship epidemic in 2019, 2020. The Trump campaign was calling MAGA Microsoft, Apple, Google, and Amazon because they were sort of a golden goose that were juicing the stock market, which was validating Trump's sort of successful economic policy. And so I think from the Trump administration's perspective, taking those companies on was kind of killing the golden goose that was justifying. And I'm imputing this, by the way. No one told me this. This is not insider knowledge, and I might be wrong about the theory at play here. But the Trump administration, for a number of reasons, I think did not understand the root of it, the extent of it, until Trump himself really started to get censored. Because a lot of this, it all started way below Trump. Fringe groups, and then specific niche communities, and then it was, and then it started to hit sort of mainstream institutions, but not the big name ones like Fox, not the shows that Trump himself would watch. And then it started to hit Trump directly. He started to get hit with these fact checks. You couldn't access things on his Twitter account without being hit with the fact check, or sometimes it would be hidden totally. And then by the end, these posts would just get deleted entirely. And I think it was really only when it started to affect the highest level inner circle that they began to really appreciate the threat it posed existentially, nationally, on policy grounds. But, like I said, I had been the crazy person doing my morning Mecca, walking the halls of the White House, knocking on every door, telling everyone that, the sky was falling. And it wasn't until it started to fall that, I think folks began to appreciate the power of the thesis that I was bringing to the conversation.
I think what you're describing here is the early warning signs, or rather the early indicators of this existing and growing censorship industrial complex that you've written about, which is, it's almost a separate topic to the foreign policy, the blob thesis you have, although they're linked, but those are sort of separate theses. Am I right sort of in thinking that?
Yes, I would say that they are hopelessly interlinked. They're part of the same sort of grand thesis, but they are separate threads in it, if you will. That is, there is there are these sets of institutions that it's fair to describe as a complex. And then there is this foreign policy establishment, and the institutions effectively serve this establishment. And so that, you can analyze them both separately,
Sorry to hammer on this, but I am curious about your time in the State Department. So you end up in the State Department. Do you bring in a team? Are you alone? And what's the atmosphere? Are you surrounded by people who are part of this counter-Trump, anti-Trump, counter-populist? We talk a lot about the deep state. We hear a lot from like conservatives and transporters. Vivek Ramaswamy constantly talks about dismantling the deep state. You had a little time in there. What is it that's going on there?
Yeah, it's everything that's alleged about it and more. There's certain things that I'm not sure it's appropriate to necessarily air publicly, because I don't want to set off a news cycle of,
set off a news cycle. Let's do it.
It was, let me say one thing up front, which is that the people at the State Department are some of the sharpest and most intellectual people, I think, in all of our federal government. There is an appreciation there of America's role in the world and the bigness of the empire, the sensitivities, the necessary diplomacy and sort of linguistic framing techniques that are needed to be rolled out to justify certain actions. The State Department is sort of the quarterback, if you will, of all of these different institutions of influence that we have. We have a Central Intelligence Agency that does plausibly deniable covert operations and intelligence in support of U.S. foreign policy objectives and covert diplomacy work. But that's coordinated by the State Department. They answer to the State Department. The CIA sort of has the same relationship with the State Department as our FBI does with the Justice Department. It's not it is a standalone agency, so to speak, but it really answers to the U.S. ambassador in the region, and the assistant secretaries and deputy assistant secretaries have to be apprised of what's happening on the underbelly of our work in order to have to be able to synthesize our policy, to be able to formulate our negotiating posture, to be able to coordinate all of the different assets and operations in the region, to bring it to bear in order to make the in order to advance U.S. interests in the country or region.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's between all the different financial institutions and USAID and the intelligence side and the DOD roles in this and all the different NGOs and all the different State Department grantees, there's a whole chessboard of pieces at play. And folks at the State Department are very, very sharp and very intellectually minded in terms of the strategic vision of how to accomplish that, and also how to do so in a way that minimizes political blowback or public perceptions of some of the darker elements of what is actually happening there.
So, go on. Sorry.
I was just going to say, and there are a lot of good people there, and there are a lot of people who are neutral and almost amoral in how they see some of these issues. But the incentives to do the worst possible thing are overwhelming. And
like what?
Well, take our U.S. national champion doctrine. We've had a doctrine of diplomacy, arguably for 2 centuries, you could say, but certainly you can argue since World War II, where there's this concept of U.S. national champions as an instrument of statecraft and as a.
What does that mean? I don't know what U.S. national champion.
A U.S. national champion is a U.S. corporation or financial firm that is based in America, and its profitability is said to advance U.S. national interests. So, for example, we mentioned like ExxonMobil. This is a big American oil and gas company, employs a lot of Americans. If ExxonMobil does well around the world, in theory, that is more jobs for Americans. That is more Americans having a middle class lifestyle. That is more Americans able to buy a home. That is more Americans able to put money in what we have, a 401k savings account. What makes a successful, prosperous society is effectively the college of corporations and financial firms that are how people get employed and how GDP is transacted. All of that money that Americans then get because an American company is doing well means Americans are now spending that money on consumer products. So that means that our consumer product in retail stores are now more successful because of this. Everything is interconnected that way. And if you define the success of our U.S. national champions as being national interest, because this is what our State Department and I presume the UK Foreign Office operates under as well, as this sort of concept of even if a country is not presenting a national security threat, as our military, our Defense Department, is tasked to leap into action if there's a security threat, even if we're not in danger from Guatemala or Sub-Saharan Africa or Central Asia, we still have a national interest in financially profiting from trade and natural resources and export markets and cheap labor markets in that region. And so rather than having the military go in, we have the State Department go in and apply carrots and sticks for, incentives, rewards and punishments to the local government or to different institutions there.
Is that where foreign aid comes in?
So foreign aid comes in, which is used both as a carrot and a stick. A carrot in the sense that it is a positive reward offering to do something, but when you've been giving a country or institutions or industrial sectors within a country that carrot for so long, the threat of withholding that carrot becomes a stick. That is, you can now sort of get them to do things because they are reliant on that, because those institutions might collapse without that aid. And U.S. aid alone is $50 billion a year. Right? It's, I think it technically gets more money than the CIA itself. And so you have this situation where the incentives of people at the State Department is to serve either these U.S. national champions, essentially these outside groups of corporations and financial firms, or the set of think tanks, NGOs, and other sort of foreign policy establishment institutions that will ultimately be how people make their money from their State Department track career, which is to say you don't make that much money at the State Department, but you have an extraordinary amount of power, but you're not converting that power into money while you're at state. I mean, if you think about this, the highest paid U.S. federal government official in American history has been Tony Fauci. Tony Fauci made something like $450,000 a year. I think the presidential salary for the U.S. president is only about $400K. If you are the head of the Central Intelligence Agency makes probably a little over half of that. You're making less than a fifth or sixth year corporate attorney in New York running the Central Intelligence Agency or running the State Department. You have this almost godlike power to overthrow governments, to create a swarm army of soft power institutions to control that country's media, to control that country's oil and gas industry, its retail markets, its trade and its tariff policy. And yet you can't even put your kids through private school in Manhattan like somebody, like someone in their late 20s, almost fresh out of law school. The payoff for your time at state comes from your time after state. And the incentive to be a good boy for those institutions, rather than for the voters who elected that government, is, it is a siren song. It is something that's very hard for people to resist. And even when they have moral misgivings, and this is my sense of it, others may disagree, even people who have moral misgivings about certain policies that they're participating in, I think the money and the incentives, both on the reward and cost side to your career, almost answers the moral questions for them. They go along to get along. They see all their friends. They see all their colleagues. They're all going to the same cocktail parties. You're all going to the same sponsored events. And the herd mentality that this is the right thing to do goes almost totally unquestioned. And it's very easy to sweep things under the rug because, well, could everybody be wrong? Could Brookings be wrong? Could the Atlantic Council be wrong? Could Chevron be wrong? Could Microsoft? Everyone's wrong, but these lug-headed voters, who are truck drivers and, Uber drivers and people working at the local grocery store, they're right. That's a hard thing, I think, for people to entertain. And the question almost gets answered for them because they believe they are entitled to that glitzy life because they are at those events.
Yeah, they're so close to it. So actually, you're just sort of describing cronyism. That's sort of a sort of version of international cronyism. These people are going to get the payoff eventually, I imagine, from this relationship with these big companies.
It's cronyism with brightly polished shoes. Typically when I think of, the cronyism almost has an almost sort of, gangsterish kind of, connotation to it. And, these are folks who are academically minded in a lot of ways. So the State Department is very cerebral. It's there's a lot of revolving door between the academic universities and State Department positions.
I mean, I've made a bit of an assumption there that in the cronyism being that I assume there's a payoff at some point.
Yes.
Right. And the payoff is
board seats on these corporations,
yeah.
Sinecures at think tanks, fellowships, book deals. I mean, there's so many different, you get picked up by hedge funds as being a macroeconomic forecaster because your connections between the diplomacy and military and intelligence worlds allow you to basically give almost insider trading knowledge to funds who have special opportunity funds to sort of predict where where a foreign exchange currency is going or where a particular industry or region is headed. For example, if you're running the Western Hemisphere desk of the State Department and you are leaving your government career essentially knowing the CIA, the State Department, the military, and the National Security Council's vision for what they're going to do with the lithium triangle in Argentina and what they're going to do in Venezuela. And is that oil, they sit on the world's third and fourth largest supplies of oil and gas. Is that going to open up? Are there early stage investments that can be made there? What's going to happen to the currencies? You can make a lot of money at way more. You'll be able to afford private school in Manhattan finally, like all of your friends, from your time after your time in government.
So that's one side of it. But you've also in your work written and spoken about the other side, which is getting involved in the politics of other nations. So you've talked about how the State Department or the CIA more specifically are involved in the Arab Spring.
Yep.
I've also read, I don't know if it's through you, about the CIA backing the Maidan Coup in 2014 in Ukraine. So there's a kind of the financial backing, big business aspect to this, but there's also a political aspect to it.
Of course. Well,
So what are the motivations there? If the motivations for the finance is financial, it's class, it's wanting to have a certain life on the individual level of those people in the State Department, what is the motivation behind the political backings of their behavior, their actions overseas?
I would call that financial as well, because the two are, again, inextricably linked. The State Department and the CIA are remarkably agnostic about the moral affinity for a particular movement. For example, in the 1970s, the State Department and the CIA basically built the Mujahideen cause in Afghanistan. These were Islamic fundamentalists, hardcore against every American value about open society and freedom and liberty and religious tolerance and all of this. These were militant, fundamentalist, religious fundamentalist groups who our national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, descended from a helicopter to give you can look this up on YouTube, Zbigniew Brzezinski's speech to the Mujahideen, who became the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, all of that has its origins in essentially CIA-sponsored paramilitary groups regionally in order to fight the Cold War. At the time, Russia was occupying Central Asia and Afghanistan, and if we could run military arms to a paramilitary terror group to make it costly to the Russian military to kick them out of regions that they were exploiting the natural resources of, it would economically and militarily cripple Russian operations, the Russian economy, the Russian military capacity all over the world. And so we sponsored and almost made a kind of, ideological love song in a way that's sort of tongue-in-cheek, in the sense that if you watch this, Zbigniew Brzezinski was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. It's effectively the head of the whole intelligence community from the White House perspective. And so, this is the person who ultimately the State Department and CIA activities in the region are going to have to get approval from. And, he's telling the Mujahideen, your cause is our cause. Your cause is righteous. God is on your side. You have the undying support of the American people. We will support you in this. Now, didn't mean we loved Islamic fundamentalism. They were our useful tools that we used for a purpose. Same thing with the Azov Battalion in Ukraine. In 2014, the U.S. government, our Congress, formally sanctioned the Azov Battalion, forbid federal funds from flowing to them. They were kicked off of Facebook as a so-called dangerous organization because they had their roots in Nazis. They Nazi regalia, Nazi songs, and the whole thing was as right-wing extremist as you could possibly, you couldn't caricature it, worse than what it was in that regard, from the open society, sort of small L liberal statecraft of our open society doctrine at state. But when
I don't know what that means.
Well, what that
open
means,
society doctrine.
Well, open society is a concept.
Do you mean the Soros open?
Well, yes, he does have the Open Society Foundation, but this links to a sort of moral tenet of American diplomacy, which is that since Woodrow Wilson in the 1910s, we've had this kind of blank check to make the world safe for democracy. This was one of the reasons that the blob, the foreign policy establishment, thinks that Woodrow Wilson is our greatest president, better than George Washington, Abe Lincoln, Barack Obama. Woodrow Wilson is the president of, our founding father, if you will, of the blob, because he basically declared this doctrine that the role of America in the world is to make the whole rest of the world safe for democracy, meaning that gives us a purview to go into any country said to be under the thumb of authoritarianism and liberate those people to bring them an open society rather than a closed one. Open meaning it has open markets, an open, free, private, free enterprise financial system, open political participation, multicultural pluralism, breaking up sort of hegemonic and nationalistic structures within a country. And this
so he's the founding father of neoconservatism.
Yes, and also neoliberalism.
Right.
This is why there is this sort of bipartisan alliance around the Wilsonian edict of open society, and this is why George Soros's operations fit so perfectly in tandem with CIA activity in the region or State Department activity in the region. And in fact, they often will sort of co-sponsor each other's work, so to speak, where state open society grantees will get USAID money and they'll get State Department grants. And it will be these same sort of Soros universities or NGOs that will effectively serve as assets for CIA activity in the region. They see this in Ukraine and Arab Spring, where you have these same Soros networks working with the National Endowment for Democracy, which is our most prolific CIA cutout. We can get to the specifics of all this if you're interested.
What does cutout mean?
A cutout means something it's a cutout of something else that spawned it. So, for example, when the CIA goes into Cuba or Venezuela to influence the internal politics of the region, or to try to regime change its government, or try to control a particular industrial sector, the CIA doesn't march in with a bunch of, name badges that say, "Hi, my name is Mike Benz. I work for the CIA. Here's my W-2 form showing that I work for the CIA." What they do is they create front groups, shell companies, a whole variety of facade organizations, whether they're parked in university centers, whether they're parked in government-organized non-governmental organizations, GONGOs or NGOs, whether they're parked in private sector companies, or pop-up companies, or specifically, or cells of a particular allied private corporation. There's any number of forms that this can take, but they are cut out of the CIA when they do that. They are not their own entity. They were set up for a purpose, and they serve that purpose.
And the National Endowment Fund.
Yes, the National Endowment for Democracy is sort of the premier CIA cutout. It was created in 1983 in a letter from our CIA director at the time, William Colby, who wrote a letter to the head of Ronald Reagan, who was the president, Ronald Reagan's Justice Department, calling for the creation of a National Endowment for Democracy to do the kinds of CIA work that the CIA was doing from the 1950s until the 1970s, but that they got in a lot of trouble for doing during our 1975 and 1976 Church Committee hearings, which was a big scandal for our CIA. Their name was dirt because left-wing groups were really mad at the CIA because the CIA was infiltrating student movements on U.S. campuses. There was something called Operation Chaos, which is basically a CIA. Again, these are their own names, just like the FBI called it Crossfire Hurricane against Trump. But to infiltrate the National Students Association and unions and other left-wing groups that were anti-war, because the CIA and the U.S. military and the State Department depended on home support for the war. Let me know if this sounds familiar, by the way, today with Ukraine. But in order for if you don't have money to pay for that war, you lose the war. Even if you've got a bigger military, you can't fund it. You can't fund your mercenary army. You can't fund the tanks. Every missile costs you $1 million. So you need the American people's support within the House of Representatives in order to fund the war. So you can lose a war in the political realm. Our sort of doctrine on this is there's 4 theaters of war. You have the strategic, the logistical, the tactical, and the political. There's 4 ways to win or lose a war. You can lose it because you got the strategy right or wrong. You can lose it because you got the tactics right or wrong. You can lose it because the logistics went well or not well, or you can lose it because your political support, fell out. And so you lack the funding, or you lack the mandate or the jurisdiction to actually continue the war. And this is why we spend a lot of time when we are in a either declared or undeclared war with another country, manipulating their internal politics to build up their anti-war movements, to lessen their own home support for the war, so that their military has less capacity. But running this back, the National Endowment for Democracy was created in a letter from the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, saying we used to have this capacity to coordinate with all these different pro-democracy groups, all these different dissident groups. And we lost that capacity during the Carter administration from 1976 to 1980. something called the Halloween Massacre, where Jimmy Carter fired 30% of the entire CIA operations directorate in a single night, because he rode to power effectively on the scandals of the intelligence community's abuse of the Democrat Party. It's now the shoe is sort of on the other foot in America now, and for essentially the same reasons. And so when Ronald Reagan won in 1980, and also, there's something called the Iran hostage crisis, which was sort of provided this political perceived need to bring back our strong CIA cloak and dagger type work to prevent another Iran hostage type situation. The pitch from our CIA director was, we need the same power back that we had from the late 1940s until the 1970s. We need to roll back the restrictions on the CIA that were put in place by the Carter administration, but we don't have the political mandate right now. Congress is divided. Democrats were in power in Congress, even though Reagan controlled the presidency. We're not going to call it the CIA when we do this now. We're going to create something called the National Endowment for Democracy, and it will do the work that the CIA used to do, but instead of it being a covert operation that operates under our cloak of plausible deniability, it will be a private sector NGO that will do democracy promotion work. And we will simply call our support for CIA-backed dissident groups democracy promotion instead of regime change.
Which is a completely paradoxical name, because it's been working against democracy in almost every case. Well,
this is the big joke, that democracy is the top threat to democracy. But if you frame things as a contest about bringing democracy to something, then you can argue that if a country's democratically elected leadership violates democratic norms and principles, then you can justify a overthrow of that country's government because the people were suffering under authoritarianism. Even though it came in the form of a democratically elected government, it doesn't have enough democracy. You need the revolution, you need the democracy promotion to give them a real democracy. And this is what happened in Ukraine. Viktor Yanukovych in 2014 was democratically elected, but he was overthrown with $5 billion in democracy promotion aid from the State Department and USAID and, the National Endowment for Democracy in order to capacity build this regime change apparatus in the name of democracy promotion, because they were arguing, that the people's will was not being respected by the government. And, there were a lot of, things there between in terms of what was really going on, but, effectively, there was, our State Department was making the argument that, that the Ukrainian government is a different thing than the Ukrainian people. It's not representing the people. The people want to join the EU. The people want to join NATO. The people want to sign on to this new IMF deal that would privatize all of their industries and sell them off to Western stakeholders. They don't want to be a part of the Russian customs trade agreement.
Even though they had just elected a leader who was Russia-facing.
Yes. And in fact, Yanukovych signed multiple $10 billion deals with Western energy companies. It's my personal opinion that Yanukovych was not some Russian puppet. He did some Russia-favorable things, but the country was half Russian. The entire eastern half of the country is overwhelmingly majority Russian ethnic. The country is sort of divided, as was East-West Germany during the Cold War, into sort of two totally different halves, and they tend to vote. The Western half tends to vote for the Western-backed, candidate, and the Eastern one tends to vote for the sort of, Russia axis type candidate. And that is the natural flow of that democracy because of its demographics and because of its geography.
I wouldn't say they're completely different. They're somewhat different. There's ethnic differences, there's language differences,
right.
But they have some concept of shared nationality.
Right. They do. But we interfered with that in a huge way. It was the U.S. State Department and our collage of CIA cutouts through something called the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, which was, David Kramer and a lot of people who had emerged during Russiagate John McCain played a big role in. They issued to Zelensky, I think his first month in office, something called the Red Lines Memo, where they threatened the incoming Zelensky administration with, quote, political instability if the administration crossed any of the something like 50 or 60 red lines for the government not to cross. Otherwise, this, almost 100 signatories of State Department and USAID grantee and CIA cutout organizations and George Soros organizations all signed in this open letter representing, effectively tens of thousands of people between all their institutions who could all take to the streets, do these rent-a-riots, and destabilize the country if the government took any of these actions on economic grounds, on security grounds, on media grounds, and on culture grounds. And one of those was, allowing the use of the Russian language on TV stations and in educations. I mean, the U.S. government effectively forbade the newly installed, Ukrainian government from allowing the Russian language to be spoken in Ukraine, where, as you mentioned, there was this, there was a sort of shared, Ukrainian national identity, but there were a lot of dialects. There were a lot of these, the Russian East, still used the Russian language and a lot of Russian sort of affinity cultural institutions. But in an attempt to bring the entire country into an unalloyed sort of NATO vassal state, we leaned on them to change their whole culture. They had to turn over their whole education ministry over to the EU. This, there's a lot of sort of funny stories about, some of the deep machinations of this also. I don't know how deep on this topic you want to go, but, this is an example where there are a huge amount of financial interests in Ukraine. I don't think that we support the Azov Battalion now and how they were welcomed in Congress and how they were restored on Facebook. They're no longer a so-called dangerous organization. They've got their free speech rights. They all of their sins against open society and against liberalism were cleansed because they were a useful pawn in the grand chess game of seizing Eurasia from Russia and other countries, and in the sort of Eurasian subcontinent. And so any asset, regardless of ideology, that's useful to that gets our money, becomes the hero of the day, and we will throw them, under the bus the moment they stop becoming useful. In the same way that, the U.S. worked with Noriega before we threw him out. The U.S. worked with Saddam Hussein before we threw him out. The U.S. worked with the bin Laden family. I mean, this is a tale as old as time. It's not really about the ideology, left or right. There's no such thing as an extremist group in that sense. It's, are you useful or not?
Am I right in understanding you think that the motivation, even for this aspect, is still money? Because, they've been throwing billions into this. And so how they measure a return on that, it's kind of hard to fully understand. It makes more sense in your earlier part of the argument when they're supporting big corporations, big businesses like the oil businesses. But when it comes to this, when they're throwing billions upon billions into these foreign affairs, foreign situations, foreign wars, how do they imagine they're getting back? Or, and this is the other opinion, are they sort of religious about spreading democracy? Are they religious about this open society as, the George Soros vision of the world, liberalism eternally, and liberalism conquering all these other ideologies? How are you landing on it being financial there?
Well, there's a lot of ways to answer this. I think what I was going to say until the very latter, part of what you said is, of course, it's financial. The religious maps onto the finances. The religion becomes flexible, and people's religion tends to change when you wave lots of money in front of them. Think about this with the Democratic Party in the U.S., right? You have right now Congress divided on this Ukraine aid issue, where the international sort of global Chamber of Commerce wing of the Republican Party is very much for Ukraine aid. These are people like the Bush family and the Cheney family and Mitt Romney and the John McCain networks. These GOP conservative, legacy families and networks within the Republican Party want $1 trillion effectively in Ukraine aid. We've already given something like $300 billion, over the course of the past 2 years, and put an inordinate amount of pressure on individual members of Congress for the most recent $60 billion aid, Ukraine aid infusion. But the Republican Party is basically split half and half now between the sort of populist nationalist wing, which does not want to keep providing Ukraine aid. We want that money to go towards helping Americans. And then you have the, this internationalist faction within the GOP who doesn't really care about nationalism, populism issues. They care about international industry and the American empire rather than the American homeland, and they are voting for that. But the majority gets passed because half of the Republican Party teams up with the entire Democrat Party. There was not a single person on the Democrats who voted against Ukraine aid. Not the sort of neoliberal, Hillary Clinton aligned type, classical Democrats that way. But not, interestingly, not the Bernie Sanders, not the AOC types, not the people who are identitarian. Think about this. Ukraine, these groups got sanctioned by Democrats in 2014 as being Nazi groups, white, ethno-nationalist, hardcore right wing. Ukraine is a hardcore right wing state. They don't want LGBT, cultural imports. They don't want, mass immigration. They are, they're an ethnic group that we would say in the United States is the highest level of privilege and, sort of this, almost the face of settler colonialism. All of these things that you hear the Democrats talk about in this country as being, their biggest issue. Not a single Democrat dissented from taking money. That $300 billion could have gone to inner city African-American communities. It could have gone to providing free medical, free health insurance for the Bernie Sanders socialist left. It could have gone towards debt forgiveness on student loans. We have a big debt crisis for young people. You would expect that Democrats ideologically are saying that $300 billion, there's a Tupac Shakur, the rapper who was murdered in 1994. They got money for the war, but they can't feed the poor. That was a left-wing anti-war slogan. And this, you would think that, but not a single one voted against that. What I'm describing here is, you would think if it was about ideology, that any of these other things would come into play than funding a hardcore right-wing, Nazi-adjacent paramilitary faction in order to fight a foreign war 5,000 miles away, and especially when they're fighting for scraps already from the fact that they are all kept in line by Democrat Party leadership, and they're beholden on that leadership for their committees and for their own appropriations on their own pet things, means they are in good standing with the blob, and they can get their cut as long as they give the blob theirs. And so that religiosity about these things ebbs and flows. And
there's another irony, which is that before this recent war started, if you look at newspaper headlines, they were regularly saying how corrupt Ukraine was and how corrupt Zelensky was.
Right.
And that's been completely forgotten. There's one thing as you speak that comes to mind is that a lot of the things you're saying, the corruption of the blob, the corruption of the CIA and the State Department, these are things that I remember hearing people like Noam Chomsky and the left saying, and they've been saying this for decades. It seems curious now that you're saying it's all of the left are supporting it, and half of the right in America, half the Republicans would. What do you make of that change? How is it that it's shifted so dramatically? I guess you might say there are some people still on the left who stuck by the principles. In this country, be George Galloway, who would still maintain this worldview.
Jeremy Corbyn too.
Jeremy Corbyn. I suspect Noam Chomsky would also agree in the States. But what do you make about this general huge Overton window shift?
I actually think it's a natural consequence of the shift of who's targeted. In the 20th century, the left, that there was a identical constellation of variables, but just with the table reversed. You had Republicans who were 100% the war party, 100% the oil and gas party, 100% the International Chamber of Commerce party, because culturally, the left sort of had control of academia and had control of Hollywood and newspapers and unions. The thing that balanced out all of that huge cultural dominance of the left and that led to relative parity between the Democrat and Republican Party in the 20th century was the fact that the right had corporations. The corporations wanted low taxes. They didn't want all this huge social welfare. They didn't want regulation. They were free market, free enterprise, low taxes. And they relied on the international battering ram of the CIA and the Pentagon and the State Department to secure their markets. And so the CIA, the CIA and the State Department and the NGOs and the Defense Department were the Republican Party's best friend politically. They were the biggest backers, the biggest financiers. They were the motor engine of it. And the target of those government operations, effectively sponsored by these corporate and financial firms who were conservative at the time, was to target left-wing socialist states. And this is because, it's really not. This is one of these things.
Venezuela is the classic example.
Venezuela, Cuba. I mean, there's a million. Between Europe, Latin America,
and Italy, when the communist regime at the end after the war.
Right. Yep. The 1948 election. That was the first election that the CIA ever rigged in January 18th, 1948. That was what kicked off our whole doctrine of the inauguration of organized political warfare was in rigging that. But you had this situation where socialist countries, the main gripe that the corporate world had against left-wing socialism, communism, was that it nationalized industry. Venezuela sits on these huge oil and gas supplies. You have these countries in the lithium triangle which sit on huge amounts of lithium. You had these Soviet-aligned Central African countries that were aligned with that were communist in the 20th century, and they sat on 85% of the world's cobalt. You had the same thing, with all the industrial sector from Western Europe all the way into Central and Eastern Europe, with all the resources and trade in Europe. And when you have socialist communist control of industry or resources, that means the government owns it. And that means it's not owned by Wall Street or London firms or corporations. And so it's just money for the taking if you can grab it. If you can overturn that government and privatize those industries, you basically loot it like a pirate robbing a ship. This is, famously what our shock therapy doctrine in Russia was in the 1990s. We in America, we refer to something called the end of history from 1991 to 1999, which was, we just won the Cold War. Boris Yeltsin was the sort of drunk puppet president of Russia who did everything that we asked. Famously in 1993, before Yeltsin bombed his own parliament building and went to war with his own government to rule it with an iron hand, he was sending fax messages to the National Endowment for Democracy, our CIA cutout, asking for their permission and giving them updates along the way. I mean, he was a sock puppet. I mean, there's even a Hollywood movie based on a true story with Jeffrey Goldblum, the guy from Jurassic Park. It's called Spinning Boris, about how Boris Yeltsin was polling at 6% ahead of the 1996 Russian election, and the U.S. sent entire delegations to basically run his entire campaign for him, and to bring the razzle dazzle of Hollywood and bring in all of these institutions and USAID money and flooding the whole zone in order to create a sort of fake electorate to keep their puppet in power, because Boris Yeltsin was going through what they called shock therapy. It was like $2 trillion worth of publicly held wealth sitting in the Soviet communist government, because the government held all the money for all the industry, the oil and gas industry, all of the rare earths and precious minerals, all of the different military contractors, the whole economy, not just of Russia, but of the entire Soviet Union, was held effectively centrally by the Russian Federation. So if you had a puppet in place running the Russian Federation, you privatize those industries, which means all that money goes for sale at fire sale prices to George Soros's Renaissance Fund and Bill Browder. It's the same people. These same people who are involved today. They are, it's amazing the family connections. They or their, or their fathers, or their, or the whole Bush network ran through that. It's amazing the same characters in Ukraine and Russia today were present during that period in the 1990s, and were making their money by effectively privatizing in the name of stopping left-wing communism. Now, these were left-wing groups, George Soros.
So what's the change now? Why is it that the left supports this stuff?
The change is because right-wing populism presents the same threat from the right-wing flank to the blob that left-wing socialism communism does. It's, populism at its heart is about the will of the people overcoming institutional consensus and putting their own welfare before that of the institutions, which manifests itself as nationalism. That is, take Hungary, right? Hungary is a country that is under a huge amount of pressure from the European Union. Just last week, it was announced they got hit with a $200 million immediate fine and $1 million a day or something fine for every day they don't comply with bringing in mass immigration, open borders type asylum into Hungary. So they're paying a huge economic penalty for their nationalist posture to maintain the heritage and the social cohesion of Hungary. At the same time, they're being punished on the, in a myriad of different ways by the EU in terms of, economic investment into it. They need to hit certain milestones. They basically foreclosed from various different financial opportunities from their West because the strings attached, or they need to open their society to get that money. So they've turned to China as an economic lifeline because China is offering that infrastructure in those loans without forcing them to do these values-based changes, these open society type changes. And that is why the first thing you see when you get off the Budapest airport is a sign for the Chinese renminbi. And the tallest building in the main square in Budapest is the Bank of China, because they've had to turn to them because the alternative is getting, their economic livelihood squeezed out of them by the US, the UK, the EU, and all of these Western stakeholders. Now, what is getting them to do that? That they are putting nationalism ahead of globalism. If they just wanted the money, they'd take the money and bring in the immigrants, bring in the LGBT, they'd turn over their education system the same way Ukraine was forced to a EU credentialing body. So all their kids would be reading about, how they need to become transgender, and there would be transgender pride parades, every month, the TV programming would all basically be inflected by, U.S. State Department type. And it would be in our interest because that would break up their nationalist, nature and bring them effectively more on board a globalist posture. But nationalism is the only force strong enough to successfully confront globalism. And there's two forms of nationalism that takes. One of them is from the left-wing flank of the blob, and the other one is from the right-wing flank. Economic nationalism, is actually a lot of what communism and socialism manifests it as, in the sense that the government takes control of the national economy, but that means that national government does, not an international super body, and they rule it with an iron fist against their own internal dissidents, but also against BlackRock, also against the United Nations, also against London banks and all portfolio companies, that involved with them. And so the blob has a right wing and a left wing flank. That socialist communist one because of the nationalization of industry, and the right wing one on cultural and social and sometimes ethnic and a variety of other sort of values based grounds. But both of them result in foreign corporations not being able to penetrate it. They take pride in their own national corporations, their own national champions. Microsoft, is not dominating Hungary. They're building their own institutions on right-wing populist, right-wing nationalist grounds. And so when that spreads like wildfire, it's the same result as left-wing. But the thing is that left-wing socialism has been successfully contained. It was the top target of the CIA and U.S. and British intelligence in the 20th century. There have been flare-ups. Jeremy Corbyn, for example, but he was targeted by NATO the same way. They ran tons of operations against Jeremy Corbyn. They ran tons of operations against Bernie Sanders when he was flirting with power in 2016 in the U.S. They ran a similar Russiagate thing against him. If you remember, there was something called the superdelegates situation where the DNC basically internally manipulated things to stop his rise against Hillary Clinton. So that left-wing flank threat exists, but it's never gotten to real power in the 21st century in the way that right-wing populism has with Donald Trump, the Brexit referendum, Bolsonaro in Brazil, the Vox Party in Spain, Matteo Salvini in Italy, the AfD Party in Germany. You can argue Modi in India. This right-wing populism is the new left-wing communism from the perspective of the CIA and the State Department.
So I was confronted with this when I met and debated Nancy Pelosi and was presenting a defense of populism, not a defense of right-wing populism over left-wing populism. On the contrary, a defense of all populism against the elite. And my experience with her was that she was sort of in a trance of her own righteousness about how evil populism was and how right her worldview was, that I didn't come away, and listeners might not like that I say this, but I didn't come away with a sense that she was acting like knowing that she was behaving evil and doing things that she was. I think she really believed that she was defending democracy. For example, I had dinner with her and her chief of staff beforehand, and they talked about the upcoming Trump election as if they had to protect democracy. Like defeating Trump meant protecting democracy, and that meant that psychologically they weren't even aware that they were acting undemocratically. So it's almost like they're blinded by their righteousness. That was my sort of impression, and I wondered if you think that there's any, if you accept that might be true, or whether you think I'm missing something.
Well, watch how fast that language changes when the money changes. We just had Lindsey Graham, one of the most powerful senators in Congress, come out and say, listen, I know we've been saying democracy, democracy, democracy for the past 2.5 years, but look, there's $12.4 trillion of natural resources under the soil of Ukraine. So if you don't care about democracy, you got to support, $100 billion.
That would answer my earlier question, by the way. If you're going to spend $300 billion supporting the war, where's the payoff? There's the payoff.
Right. But the payoff doesn't mean Americans are going to get $12.4 trillion, right? This is where the split starts to happen, which is that, and this gets back to our U.S. national champions doctrine, that money is going to go to the companies harvesting that and to the banks making the loans and investments and the hedge funds and private equity firms making the investments in that. That's not necessarily going to go to the American people because our manufacturing is all offshored. Our labor base is offshored. That $12.4 trillion, it's Americans paying for it, but it's not necessarily Americans who are getting that return on investment. And this is where, this is where it starts to get, where the sort of bigger picture of it all really starts to, I think, click, or at least it sort of has to, I think, to take in the totality of it, which is that, I always refer to the blob as referring to within the government, primarily it's the State Department, the intelligence community, and the Defense Department. It's our diplomacy, defense, and intelligence trifecta. And it's the same thing I would say, for example, on the UK side, because it's very much a transatlantic. The US and UK there's almost no daylight between the two. There's constant coordination. So it's that, diplomacy, defense, and intelligence axis within the government. But then above that, you have these corporate and financial firms who I refer to as the donor and drafter class into the blob. And they're sort of the overclass of the blob. If the operations of it manifest in the CIA activity in the region or the State Department plans or the NGO swarm army, you have this corporate and financial sort of overclass. And when I refer to them as a drafter class, I mean that they draft in the same way that a bike race works. You know how in a bike race, the strategy is to not be out in front where you are facing the full force of the wind, but even if you are the fastest racer, you want to stay behind the person in front and then only overtake them on the last lap, on the last leg of the race, because the person out in front does all the work. It's energetically inefficient to be out in front in a bike race because you are cutting the wind. And so you can coast, spending way less energy going at the same speed by just being immediately behind them. This is the way U.S. and all multinational corporations effectively and financial firms operate when it comes to this kind of government activity in Ukraine or in Venezuela or in Central Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, or you name it, which is that they draft off of the activities of the Defense Department, the CIA, the State Department. They are not cutting the wind. It is not, ExxonMobil, for example, who is, hiring spending $100 billion to create a paramilitary, group to retake a region where the petroleum reserves are. It's not ExxonMobil who's spending $50 billion in U.S. aid grants to a bunch of universities and lawyers and journalists in the region to get soft power sentiment. That's U.S. taxpayers. That's truck drivers and first grade school teachers. And so you have this collage of corporations and financial firms who are profiting off of the payments being made by middle-class Americans, when those companies themselves are not required to hire those Americans, in their factories. While they are offshoring their manufacturing, they're offshoring, production. They're not even headquartered oftentimes in the U.S. Or they've done elaborate tax finagling to not even have to pay into the U.S. tax base. So they are effectively looting Americans. You have a member of Congress saying, hey, $12.4 trillion. That's going to make America $12.4 trillion richer. So you actually should support this for financial reasons. Well, you can see why they support it for financial reasons, because these are the big campaign donors to these senators. And just like Nikki Haley and others, they'll float onto a board seat at Raytheon or at an oil company or at a hedge fund, after their time there. It is robbing Peter to pay Paul. They're dangling the $12.4 trillion. You're paying for it, but you're not getting the return from that. That's not going to reduce your medical care payments or increase your ability to buy a house. It's just going to make the CEO of Raytheon richer, so to speak.
Do you not think America should have supported Ukraine in the war?
It's a good question. It's strange for, if I'm hesitating, it's because to answer that question, there are so many layers that come before it that I haven't even really, honestly, had to think about where I actually fall on the underlying issue, because the process is so corrupted, which is to say that anybody who is against it is targeted by the state. It's effectively something called FISA, which, has been joked by one of our senators as being, the federal investigators stalking Americans. It's basically a way that, we lived through Russiagate, this thing where anybody who supported a détente with Russia was effectively deemed to be a Putin puppet. And then you could launch a federal investigation. You could bring in indictments and domestic spycraft on, Trump's whole campaign because of his policy of neutrality with Russia, effectively, and his NATO skepticism. They were able to argue, that he was effectively a Russian puppet, and so they spied on his campaign.
Same thing's happening today in Britain with Nigel Farage. There's a speech that's emerged from that he made after the Maidan Coup back in 2014, saying that there will be a war. This is provocative. There will be a war, and all the mainstream media is coming out after him and saying he's a Putin apologist, and he's even outright condemned Putin, very much anti-Putin. But because of him making this prediction, he's been called a Putin apologist. I think it's a continuation of what you're describing.
Oh, it's the same thing. And so I think the way I would answer the question is, if you took the gun off of my head, where the state, the regime, the NGOs, the cutouts, the media, the lawyers, the federal investigators all said, hey, you know what? If you have your own opinion on the Ukraine war, I'll put the gun down. Then maybe I'd think about it and say, okay, well, maybe. maybe we can now talk about whether or not it actually redounds to U.S. interests to try to secure these $12.4 trillion in the natural resource, whether it redounds to our benefit to have this elaborate CIA State Department operation to kill Gazprom and pry all the profits off with this endogenous, Ukraine petro industry and lifeline by all these, U.S. oil and gas companies and British companies like Shell. Maybe. But the answer is a hard no while they still have a gun to my head, because you can't do that.
Okay, so let's say there's no gun to your head. Like, let's say you were running the country, you were president when that happened. What would your decision have been to do?
I feel like that is a irresponsible, for in my position, that feels like a hypothetical that is kind of irresponsible for me to indulge in, because there is a gun to my head.
Okay, but the point of the question is, it's easy to criticize, but practically speaking, there has to be what would have been the better thing to do. There has to be some sort of alternative, right?
Well, if there's not, so the censorship industry runs through this story in a huge way. The censorship industry grew out of Ukraine. The whole infrastructure of censorship that Americans live under and inherited during the 2016 presidential election cycle came from the 2014 U.S.-UK overthrow of the Ukrainian democratically elected government. When we orchestrated that coup, when the head of the U.S. embassy was personally handing out cookies and water bottles to the January 6th style protesters surrounding the Parliament building, pumping them full of money, when our own senators like John McCain were there on the ground calling for a transition of the government, when we overthrew that government and then did not expect the blowback, did not expect the counter coup, when the entire eastern side of Ukraine broke away and declared itself a breakaway state in 2014, and when Crimea voted in its referendum to formally join the Russian Federation, this set off a total crisis across NATO. And called for a fundamental reimagining of how NATO understood warfare. This gave rise to something which I've talked a lot about. First was called the Gerasimov Doctrine, then it was called hybrid warfare, now it's sort of called sharp power. But it was essentially this idea that NATO could no longer just be a military alliance. It had to expand its mandate, and this is a direct quote from Jens Stoltenberg, from tanks to tweets. The reason that we lost in Ukraine was because we lost the information war. We lost to Russian propaganda infecting the minds of Ukrainians, and it was Russian propaganda who was infecting the minds of Germans, because at the time the German AfD party was on the rise. They were running on restoring gas relations with Russia, because they were mostly a sort of working class, sort of like Trumpism. They were running on sort of, because these sanctions that the U.S. State Department and UK Foreign Office effectively imposed on all these different other European countries after Crimea to sanction Russian gas, which was the cheapest gas. The alternative was LNG, liquefied natural gas, harvested in Houston, liquefied, shipped 5,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, deliquefied in ports in Portugal or in through the Baltic Strait into Poland, deliquefied, transported. Then that's orders of magnitude more expensive than Russia, which means the industries suffer, which means the middle class suffers, the welfare safety net suffers. So AfD was running on restoring gas relations with Russia. Marine Le Pen was running on the same from France. So was the Vox party in Spain. And so NATO was saying, oh my God, these right-wing populist parties are all, running on this economic nationalist, what's best for us, don't care what the US or UK says about, being a good global citizen and sanctioning Russia. We want to do what's economically best for our own middle-class citizens. And so our intelligence state, the trans-military alliance of NATO, at that point in 2014 declared this hybrid warfare doctrine and said, war is actually not about tanks anymore. It's about tweets. It's about control over social media, because we lost to Russia without Russia firing a bullet. Crimea voted itself to join the Russian Federation. So that you can win it's the same thing as if they had rolled into Crimea with tanks and submarines. They now control it because they elected, because of the referendum of the people. Well, where are they getting their information? They're getting it through online news sites. They're getting it through RT and Sputnik and through social media and through Telegram. And so so all war is now more about who's got the best, missiles and who's got the best anti-aircraft. They were talking in 2017 in NATO periodicals that the age of conventional warfare was ended forever. Frankly, I think this move into control over information actually left them underprepared for what happened in 2022, because they were talking like war will never happen again. Because at the time, NATO had never had to fire a defensive bullet, ever. Since 1949. It had only been offense in 1995 with Yugoslavia, 1999, Libya, 2011, 2013. And so from 2014 to 2016, because of what happened in Ukraine, NATO began to establish these censorship cells stretching all the way from Germany to Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. They called them centers of excellence for strategic communications. They had all these fancy names, but they were censorship coordinating centers where they worked with YouTube, they worked with Facebook, they worked with Twitter. They brought them all in. They filled these social media companies up to the brim with CIA intermediaries, with British intelligence intermediaries, and they developed this censorship technology, these NLP, these AI censorship techniques to be able to scan the internet at scale and look at what people were saying on the internet. What are the trending narratives? And it was then when Brexit happened in June 2016 and the Trump election happened in November 2016 that this censorship architecture coming out of their loss of Ukraine was grafted onto U.S. citizens. And that history is unforgivable. I cannot entertain, while the gun is still to my head and to all of my friends' heads and all of my colleagues' heads and half of Congress's heads and the current winning in the polls presidential elections head, the cancer has spread in our body because they've held that gun to our heads for so long. They have effectively ended the First Amendment in my country using this Ukraine excuse. Right now, the Biden administration is arguing to our Supreme Court that the First Amendment is effectively outdated, needs to be wholesale reimagined, because just as the Second Amendment did not envision assault rifles, democracy did not envision in our First Amendment social media. The power of everyone to be our own publisher undermines U.S. national security. It prohibits a federal government coordination.
Is this Murphy, Missouri?
Yes, yes. They are making this argument that the crisis of democracy from Ukraine into COVID into presidential elections now requires government control over the information ecosystem, or at least government influence on it, in order to quarterback what the independent media does. So it's not independent anymore. To quarterback what the civil society institutions are doing, to quarterback what the technology companies are doing. Well, guess what you call that? 5 years ago, we called that North Korea. That is government control of the information ecosystem. This is the same thing our State Department passed sanctions on North Korea for doing in 2017, passed sanctions on Iran for doing. We don't recognize elections as being free and fair unless there is a free and open independent media ecosystem. That is one of our 7 measures for determining whether we formally acknowledge the results of an election. Now, of course, this is all cynical, because that's when a government, does not allow our CIA or State Department or USAID or NED-backed groups to be able to spread their propaganda. And I don't even mean that pejoratively. I mean, that's the utility of this thing, is that we built free speech as an instrument of statecraft in order to bolster support for political movements. But what I'm driving at here is I will not even entertain, because my answer is a hard no. I do not support the U.S. agenda on Ukraine and infinite monopoly money, unaccountable, or even with a fair amount on it, while our entire censorship industrial complex, while the entire finances of the censorship industry is built on the back of it. You can ask me that question again once that whole system is dismantled.
So on Russia, Ukraine, I just want to talk about recent escalations. For anyone who's listening who is, let's say, a hard yes opposed to you. On the 5th of June, the Kremlin spokesman Peskov says the US is an enemy of Russia for the first time. On the 10th of June, Biden lifts a ban on use of US weapons in Russian territory, i.e. it's now offensive rather than defensive. On the 11th of June, the next day, Russia sends warships to Cuba armed with hypersonic missiles for which American mainland does not have defense for. And on the 23rd of June, a couple of days ago, yesterday, Ukraine sent missiles into Crimea, American weapons, as if we understand correctly, killing 5, including 3 children, amongst the 124 victims. This seems awfully like we're on the brink of major. It's just been escalating and escalating. Are we on the brink of World War III?
It's tough because these actions are also consistent with an intention to negotiate, what I accidentally once called a peacefire, but now I sort of like the term, a sort of peace and a ceasefire, with the emphasis on the fact that there's still kind of a fire. So, there was something called the Minsk Accords, for example, which was sort of a declared peace, when the 2014 coup happened, and then the counter coup happened, and then there was the sort of Kiev military offensive to reconquer these breakaway states in Ukraine. And, there was said to be this basically hot peace declared where Russia and the U.S. would sort of put down their arms. But at the same time, there was all this, while the peace was declared, there was this, shy of the formal U.S. military, we effectively had sort of covert, cloak and dagger, guerrilla operations, and this, the conflict played out in a sort of smaller level. But there was this high level, sort of peace declared. Now, of course, I think Victoria Nuland, our head of the U.S. Embassy there, would later come out and say, that basically the whole thing was a ruse so that we could use that peace to build up Ukraine's military power to then betray the peace at the appropriate time once Ukraine was strong enough to fight on its own. But I think a similar thing is being fashioned now. I hope it is, at least. But you could read the present trajectory as leading to World War III, or you could also lead to it as an attempt to create a credible threat against Russia in order to have leverage to go back to when the negotiations ultimately happen to declare some form of peace, which is to say that right now Russia has all the leverage. They have conquered, a huge amount of territory. They have undeniably had outsized success on the military battlefield. They are draining European and American resources far faster than their own resources being drained, because China has now stepped in to provide a huge lifeline, including this new Power of Siberia gas pipeline, which effectively, undermines a lot of the State Department's initial vision for why to even do this in the first place, in the sense that the whole idea was to bankrupt Russia because their economy depended on the fact that they're Europe's largest importer of natural gas. And if you kill all those gas exports from Russia, you kill their military industrial complex, because their whole economic revenue model can't support their air defense systems and their small arms industry to Africa, and their missiles, for the Ukraine war. All that collapses if they don't have this underlying energy economy. But now China, they just, they're building this Power of Siberia pipeline that's going to reroute all that gas to China, who's going to get it at a super cheap deal. But effectively, Russia has not been, and then you have India stepping in, and, Russia actually just overtook the U.S., for the first time in 2 years as the largest exporter of gas to Europe because of how it's being laundered through these other countries. So Russia is winning on all fronts right now in this. And so if they were to hold negotiations, if the State Department delegation were to talk to, Lavrov and their counterparts in Russia right now, the way that deal would have to play out is that the U.S. would have to concede Russia would keep the territory that it's already acquired, and there would be effectively an end to Russian aggression in Ukraine, predicated on the withdrawal of NATO military support and some sort of pledge for Ukraine not to join NATO, and various other concessions that would essentially freeze the state of play. That way, because the main risk right now is that Ukraine is going to lose more territory, and they're going to lose it in a more accelerated fashion as the months play out. And then it will be even harder at that point to ask for the rescission of all this territory back to Ukraine, and other sort of details that would want to be negotiated. So it's been my belief that the U.S. and UK would call for offensive action and fatalities to Russians, and for Russia to feel the pain on their own homeland in order to have the incentive to give back the territory to stop the bleeding that there are. If they're not bleeding already, and this is a common State Department tactic, we call it destabilisation, which is basically, a country does something you don't want it to do. You send a delegation, you say, don't do that. They say, we're going to do it. They say, that's a bad idea. We go, well, it's our country. State Department goes back, has a talk with Treasury, has a talk with all the other stakeholders, International Development Corporation, World Bank, IMF, all the private industry, whatever. We get our consensus together, and then we go back and we say, well, listen, you can do it, but you're going to face, and again, I come back to, that term that we threatened the Zelensky with. You're going to face political instability if you do. You are going to have internal instability within your country. And this, for example, manifests itself like what just played out in Georgia and Slovakia. Both of these, and Serbia. All these countries have attempted to pass what the U.S. version of what we call FARA, the Foreign Agent Registrations Act, which is a requirement to disclose foreign sources of funding. So we use this in order to suss out Russian, covert Russian support of U.S. institutions. If China or Russia are secretly bankrolling a politician or a university center or something like that, and you're effectively serving as an arm of another country, we have these reporting requirements for your sources of income or grants from foreign countries. So Serbia and Slovakia and Georgia have all attempted in the past 12 months to pass a similar foreign agents reporting requirement in their countries, which the State Department is calling the Russian law, because they say the Russians are putting these countries up to it because it's going to basically expose just how controlled the civil society organizations within Serbia and Slovakia and Georgia are by the U.S. State Department and USAID and CIA cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy. Again, we pour billions of dollars into those regions to control those universities, to control those politicians, to control those journalists. And so when those laws came into effect, those same institutions organized these rent-a-riots to take to the streets, to surround the Parliament building, to hold riots, to block the streets and shut down industry. All the union groups that our CIA effectively works with through something called the Solidarity Center all do walkouts and basically shut down the country in effectively an organized riot in order to stop the passage of that bill. And in some cases, they were successful. This is what political instability looks like. And this is what but if you don't have the threat to destabilize the country, then you can't get that country to do that in a successful negotiating posture. And if I can actually give one example, everyone can look this up if you're listening right now. In 2021, the U.S. Special Forces Perspective, under Mark Milley, our chairman of the Joint Chiefs, put out an entire instruction manual for how the U.S. military can work with the State Department and our intelligence services to organize a rent-a-riot, to destabilize a country in order to bring them to the negotiating table. They gave an example of a hypothetical West African country where a member of U.S. Special Forces is on a separate mission, driving down a highway, and notices a billboard for Chinese infrastructure investment into a new port in this Western African country. And the unit takes note of this billboard on a highway in Western Africa with Chinese symbols on it. They do their own investigation and figure out that this is part of a real estate development project from Chinese investors that as part of that development project will have the construction of a Chinese naval port in this West African country, where in theory, China would then be able to project naval influence in the Atlantic Ocean,
This is the China blob.
Yes. Well, yes. And so yes, it is. And there's absolutely factionalism within this. But what the Special Forces Guide calls for is coordination with the State Department, coordination with our intelligence services, coordination with our psychological operations unit to take all of our assets in that West African region. And in that case, what they did is they planned to work with the unions. What they did is they embarked in a social media influence campaign they embarked on in this hypothetical, they go through how they would activate all their media assets, all of their civil society institutional assets, and all of their union assets to have the union labor pool in that West African country active. Well, actually, there was one thing that happened first. Is they first then went in this hypothetical. The State Department sent a delegation to persuade the West African country to forbid the development license to the Chinese developer, and the head of that West African government said no. And because something was happening in the hypothetical in the next 30 days, there was a time sensitivity to generate an instability event to stop this using sectionally a time-sensitive emergency. And so the way they generated that was they worked with their union contacts in the region and the media contacts in the region, and created this whole social media campaign to inflame the sentiments of the West African labor union workforce who were working for Chinese companies at the time. Because in this hypothetical, the Chinese mining firms and Chinese industry, was employing a lot of these Africans. And it was to destabilize the country, to bring the mines, to bring the factories, to bring all of the Chinese production in the region to a halt, and to put all these Africans out of jobs, and to bring the African government effectively to a standstill. At the same time, in their own Special Forces manual, it called for support from U.S. aid to provide these same striking miners alternative jobs, so that while they were striking from the Chinese labor companies, they were still getting paid by U.S. taxpayers. So they were financially bribed effectively to boycott Chinese industry and to devastate their own country's government, create this crisis, and then use the State Department delegation to go back to the negotiating table with the West African government and promise to end the destabilization if the development was halted. And in that hypothetical, the West African government then rejects the license for the real estate development of China, and that is declared as an unalloyed success by the U.S. Special Forces and their partner network in the State Department and intelligence. And this is the way of our diplomacy, in 2021. And this is all publicly available if you look at the Special Forces prospectus. And when this goes live, I'll post this on my X account at Mike Benz Cyber, so that you can don't take my word for it. But this is how we operate. And so I see what we're doing with these missile attacks and with these calls for our 12 CIA bases on the Russian border to be able to do long-range precision-guided strikes into Russia as maybe setting off World War III, but it may also be part of a destabilization threat that gives Russia a reason to give the territories back to Ukraine in order to stop the blood from its own main arteries.
So just on destabilization, it appears to me that the Biden-Blinken foreign policy has been an unmitigated disaster for the world, just total destabilization. Of course, we've talked about Russia-Ukraine. We've not talked about the recent Hamas Gaza conflict, Israel-Gaza conflict, which is the second conflict there under Biden. I'll remind listeners there were two under Obama as well, and none under Trump. There is, of course, the Afghanistan pullout, where $7 billion of American military equipment was left with the Taliban. There's even some reports that some of that equipment ended up in the hands of Hamas.
Right.
Meanwhile, we have Taiwan on the brink. Now, I can't predict what's going to happen there. By comparison, if you look at what was the state of the world under Trump, when you were in the State Department, it's a lot more stable. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it wasn't so stable. Maybe there's something I didn't understand. But there's a clear difference there. And given how set the establishment are on preventing a further another Trump presidency, what I can't understand is how they can't see the difference of global stability between the two. If they purport to want peace, which they might say they do, although this conversation would suggest they have no interest in peace. The way, for example, Trump, and this is more Jared Kushner, that what they did with the Abraham Accords, what they did for peace in the Middle East was it was utterly magnificent by comparison with anything that's happened for decades and decades before, and certainly all the time since. I kind of want your opinion on what it was about Trump and his foreign policy that made things so drastically different, and what the threat of his foreign policy is to the establishment that opposes him.
Mm-hmm. Well, world peace is not a good thing if you need destabilization and violent seizures by force or coups in order to, make your money or get what you want. That is, if there's world peace in Ukraine right now, while Russia occupies the Donbass and Crimea, well, that's world peace at a price tag of $12.4 trillion, right? And as we talked about that figure from Lindsey Graham. So they'll do they'll want world peace when they're totally in charge of the world. Until then, it's war. I mean, that's effectively their posture. So while they may posture towards peace, they'll want peace in the regions under their control, in regions that they want to loot, in regions they want to regime change, in regions they want to destabilize, in regions where they want military activity. Peace is the enemy. We call this stabilization. It's the inverse of destabilization. When we install a new puppet government, for example, in Afghanistan, we installed a guy named Hamid Karzai as basically the tin pot dictator of the entire country. His brother was the narco trafficking heroin warlord of the whole country. He ruled with an iron fist. And that was a part of a stabilization mission, all of the U.S. support, to protect that government. Once we toppled Afghanistan and we're sitting on its natural resources and we're, using it for our geopolitical purposes, then we wanted stabilization in Afghanistan. But, while it was run by the Taliban, until 2003 or so, peace was the enemy. And what you had with Trumpism was the first time in 40 years that an American president did not enter a new war. The first time in 4 decades. Before it had been since cell phones and, personal computers. I mean, it wasn't even the information age. We were still in the sort of almost late industrial era, but since we last not declared, a new territory for a theater of war. Trump also put an end to Obama's war in Syria. Trump basically threatened to demolish a lot of these democracy promotion programs. He went to war with the National Endowment for Democracy. And
Oh, really? What did he do to them?
Well, he threatened to roll back a lot of their funding, a lot of their remit. There's something called the USAGM, it's the Agency for Global Media, which was the entity in control of former CIA proprietary media organizations like Voice of America and Radio Free Europe that, basically called for a total reimagining of and folding things, making them so-called like less independent because what they were doing was crazy and bringing them more under the White House's executive domain. And I mean, there's so many things. I mean, the main one is this policy on seizure. I sort of call it the axis between maximum pressure on Russia versus maximum pressure on Iran. This maximum pressure on Russia program, really kicked off with Ukraine in 2014. Obama had wanted to do this reset with Russia. There's this famous moment in the 2012 election cycle where Obama was running against Mitt Romney from the Republican side, and Obama was caught on essentially hot mic telling a Russian diplomat that the U.S. would have more flexibility after the election to deal with, I think it was Medvedev, who was the president at the time. But he basically said, listen, I need to take a hawkish posture with you publicly because I'm being challenged from my right by Mitt Romney from the Republicans. They're Russiagating me. So I want a reset with Russia. This is in 2012, but I need to pretend that I'm against you guys so that I can win this election. And famously, there was an episode where Mitt Romney was sort of using effectively calling Obama a Putin puppet in the 2012 presidential election cycle. And Obama responded, the 1980s called, they want their foreign policy back. Basically saying it's not the 1980s anymore. The Cold War's over. You're allowed to be nice to Russia. Now, this would all reverse 3 years later when the
Obama's
right.
Putin apologist.
Well, because at the time they were making all these deals, the Clinton administration, the Clintons were, had this whole Uranium One thing where they were making these private sector deals because Russia sits on $75 trillion of natural resources. The U.S. only has $45 trillion of gross exploitable natural resources. So even though we've got 3 times their population and 10 times their GDP, and, on every conceivable metric, it's a more advanced economic, society, the raw economics are almost half of what Russia has. But because Russia does not have an industrial base capable of exploiting itself, the best thing is for American firms to essentially partner with the Russian government to exploit it, the same way that these firms partnered with Naftogaz in Ukraine, $10 billion deal between ExxonMobil and Naftogaz in Ukraine, so that we'd have a profit-sharing agreement. American corporations would basically split 50-50, what was extracted out of Ukraine. We do the same thing in Mexico. We do the same thing in Canada. We've been wanting to do the same thing with Russia, or just taking it over entirely if you can control the presidency, like we did during the Yeltsin era, but now is sort of, no longer really an option because our network within Russia has been decimated. Russia passed a law in 2015, a foreign agents law, that kicked the National Endowment for Democracy out of the country and kicked U.S. aid out of the country, made it essentially illegal to take U.S. CIA money, which is a step that no other country in Central and Eastern Europe has actually taken, I think, other than Belarus, which is effectively, allied with Russia that way. But there was this big pivot point between Iran and Russia because they are, even though Russia has many other natural resources besides just the oil and gas, Russia has all this uranium and iron ore and aluminum and copper and coal, and it's got everything. It's just incredibly bountiful. Iran is also one of the most bountiful countries in the world in terms of natural resources, but it's oil and gas, and it's all been under sanctions since effectively 1979. When Iran reversed. Now they did it through Islamic fundamentalism, but the CIA, Kermit Roosevelt, with help from the UK, overthrew the government of Iran in 1954, and then they were reverse overthrown by the Islamic fundamentalists in 1979. So I'm not arguing the normative. I'm not pro-Islamic fundamentalism. I'm not pro-Iran in any way, but there is a kind of complication about how to deal with these things and whether these kind of regime change operations are actually even strategically beneficial because of the blowback and the risk of counter coup with a population who never forgives you. But there's so much money in Iran that even though much of the blob hates the Iranian government, both on democracy-based grounds and on normative grounds, for what they do, how they oppress their own people, how they are in violation of our open society doctrine, 6 ways from Sunday, so to speak. The fact is if those sanctions could be relieved, because they sit on the world's second and third largest supplies of oil and gas, after the U.S. and Russia, an unbelievable amount of just, it would be like an asteroid coming in from outer space and just having the world's second and third largest, supplies of oil and gas just suddenly come onto the market. You can imagine how many vultures would descend on that, to mine that. Well, it's all been sitting there in Iran untapped. And the NATO foreign policy establishment effectively devised a plan in 2014, 2015 to open up Iran, especially in response to Crimea in 2014, where they put maximum pressure on Russia in order to retake the Donbass and Crimea and finally kill Gazprom, which is the motor engine of Putin's rise to power. It's how Russia reacquired political influence over Central and Eastern Europe starting in 2005, 2006. Some of this gets back to some of the earlier duels that the State Department had against Putin, from 20 years ago now. But if they could simply have an alternate supply of the gas, for example, and reroute it from Gazprom, where it would either come from Houston and shipped in the form of LNG, or it'd come from Shell, from British oil and gas companies, or it could come from Iran, because Iran can simply construct a pipeline or use its existing pipeline infrastructure from Iran into Azerbaijan, and from there you could put it into Ukraine, or you could put it, into the central and all the way through to Western Europe, sourcing it from Iran. And this would be massively profitable, hundreds of millions of untapped, revenues annually if you could just exploit it. But the issue is that presented a threat to both a lot of people in the U.S. foreign policy establishment, but also to Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is the main oil and gas player in the region. If Iran suddenly becomes co-equals with them, or even surpasses them, because I believe they sit on technically more raw than even Saudi Arabia, then Saudi Arabia loses all that market share to Iran, and they're making lower profits on their lower market share, the lower margins, because now there's all this extra supply on the market, which drives down the prices. So they're selling to less people, they have less markets, and they're making less margins and their entire economy is built on oil and gas. So they were interested in stopping the Iran deal, which was signed in early 2015 by the Obama administration, on economic grounds. And you had the Israeli government with the Likud party and Netanyahu, who were opposing the Iran deal vociferously on security grounds, because Iran and Qatar, and they actually share a lot of that, they share a lot of these fields together, actually. If Iran,
they're allies.
Yes, they're allies, and Iran sponsors everyone from the Hamas to Hezbollah to the Houthis, and they were already giving a military security nightmare to Israel, as is, with Iran being effectively a middling second world economy under crushing U.S. sanctions. You can imagine the massive security threat Israel would face if the sanctions were lifted, and then suddenly Iran has got $100 billion more a year to fund Hamas and Hezbollah with. And so this became a crisis moment that put the Obama administration and Israel at total loggerheads with each other. And they did very bitter battle from 2015, 2016. And this drew Israel and Saudi Arabia into an alliance that ultimately gave rise to the Abraham Accords, because Saudi Arabia and Israel were both effectively allied, against the same Obama administration, Biden administration foreign policy, because Biden was the vice president at the time. And both the Israeli government and the Saudis loved Trump. The first act that Trump did when he took office was to end the Iran deal, the Iran energy deal. And I don't call it the Iran nuclear deal. That was technically what it was called, because it was a lifting of sanctions on Iranian oil and gas in exchange for Iran agreeing to not develop nuclear weapons and agree to weapons inspectors. But that wasn't really what was at play here. What was at play here was the money from the oil and gas. It was an energy deal, not, the big threat wasn't they were going to develop.
It was a pointless deal, because even Obama, and this is something that Barak Ravid did in his book, Trump's Peace, he showed that even when Obama brought that deal in, he knew that Iran weren't going to abide by it.
Right. But it was about lifting the sanctions and creating these partnerships. Like China, for example, just signed a $400 billion deal with Iran for the oil and gas. This is a major, they're basically doing a backdoor Iran deal. Hunter Biden himself was having these same, Chinese energy firms as his clients when he was running his consultancy firm during that time. The whole Biden world NATO foreign policy establishment was backing the Iran deal, and they were challenged by Israel and Saudi Arabia. And so Israel and Saudi Arabia naturally supported Donald Trump, naturally loved Trump's presidency, and have existed in this total state of fear and chaos with Biden taking power again. And, listen, Chuck Schumer is the head of the United States Senate. He is the, majority leader. He is the number one most powerful, most senior person in our entire Senate, which is the upper chamber of our executive legislative body. And he formally called 3 months ago for new elections in Israel. That is, he called for regime change in Israel, saying that the election of Netanyahu was not legitimate. Joe Biden was asked about that the next day because it set off so many headlines, and he said he didn't disagree with Chuck Schumer's synthesis there. So you have the President of the United States and the head of the U.S. Senate effectively calling to regime change the present government, the present Israeli government. Now, when the President of the United States and the head of the U.S. Senate, who's ex officio on the Senate Intelligence Committee and is read into all of that, he's famously the same guy who told Trump not to mess with the intelligence community. Chuck Schumer did, because they have 6 ways from Sunday to get back at you. When they make those kinds of comments, the head of the state, the State Department head and the head of the CIA don't just go back to their desk with their thumb up their butt. This is effectively, in my view, undeclared U.S. policy to regime change the present government of Israel and put in a Benny Gantz type, put in somebody who will accede to the Biden world NATO vision for Iran, and by proxy Qatar and UAE and all these other sort of states that sit in this uneasy tension. I think they want to put in an Israeli president who will play ball with the financial schemes of NATO and NATO's financial stakeholders, and that what we see are effectively AstroTurf rental riots, as we just saw last night in Israel, where lo and behold, you trace the money. These are coming from USAID grantees and UN grantees and Soros fundies, who are actually the ones who are doing these riots. There's so many angles here. Where you mentioned the arms going to Hamas and Hezbollah, and I believe that they are trying to destabilize Israel, to bring Israel effectively to the negotiating table on this new orientation of Middle East power politics, and effectively doing the kind of regime change tactics that they've done to every other country. And I'll just end this rant with one other observation. This thing which set off this major schism between NATO and Israel, and between NATO and Saudi Arabia. And of course, Saudi Arabia just declared that they are not going to renew their petrodollar pledge that's been in existence for 50 years. And now our news media is suddenly blaming them for 9/11. Suddenly now it's all this this heat against Israel and Saudi Arabia, both metapolitically and in our own universities, which are getting funding from these same institutions. Who is the head of who is Bill Burns, the guy who is our current head of the Central Intelligence Agency? It's Bill Burns was the lead negotiator for the State Department on the Iran deal. The guy who was the number one position within the State Department doing battle with Israel, or against Israel's objections for the Iran deal, doing battle with Saudi Arabia and all the Saudi stakeholders' objections to the Iran deal. The guy who personally ran over the Israeli government and Saudi Arabian government to do NATO's bidding on the Iran deal has now been promoted to the head of the entire Central Intelligence Agency.
Wow.
Do you think they're doing nothing? I don't.
There's so many sort of threads here that we've covered. I want to just bring us to the close with one last question, but I appreciate I might be opening a can of worms here, Mike. But it seems that a lot is on the line with this upcoming presidential election. I guess there's part of me assumes, and this isn't the question I was going to ask, but part of me assumes that a new White House administration can actually drastically change how the State Department works, and how even if it's a lot of the same people within the State Department and the CIA, there can actually be a change. And we of course have the presidential election coming up. We didn't talk that much about censorship in this conversation, but listeners will find you speaking brilliantly on the topic elsewhere, and hopefully you'll come back and we can talk about that as well. I'm curious to know whether you think Trump can win this, and it's not just in the polling shows that he is ahead as we speak. However, also, and this is something I read this morning, a woman called Rosemary Jenks at the Immigration Accountability Project, describing how a Biden executive order from 2021 was being used to give votes. It's called the Get Out the Vote machine, and it's been used to give votes to non-citizens, aliens in America. Now, this story suggests that dare I say, there's a rigging, or dare I say, there is nefarious things happening to manipulate the election. We saw some of this. We didn't talk about the Hunter Biden laptop story, but only this month that the Hunter Biden laptop was used as evidence against Hunter Biden, and he was received 3 felony charges because of information and photographs and videos inside that. But of course, that was censored. Are we seeing now new ways where the censorship complex is mobilizing to get rid of Trump, to make sure he doesn't win? Is this the same sort of thing that we saw at the last election?
Yeah. Well, the role of censorship in it is very interesting because in the 2020 election cycle, there was no institutional counterpressure to their operations. There was, there was no action by Congress. There was no action by state attorney generals. There was no action by private lawyers. There was very little coverage by the media. And there were no social media platforms who were under the control of free speech aligned leadership. All of that has changed in the past 24 months. Congress is constantly investigating the censorship issue, constantly issuing subpoenas, constantly holding hearings and investigations and reports. We have 4 different state attorney generals across our 50 states who have all taken legal action against various censorship activities. There's private sector censorship firms who are litigating this and putting, a lot of cost on the censorship industry, for a lot of their malfeasance. The media covers these issues constantly now. And perhaps most importantly, the single most influential platform for all political thought leadership across the world is Twitter. Even though it's the smallest platform in terms of size, I think they have 600 million monthly active users, whereas Meta, has 2 billion across Facebook and Instagram, and YouTube is the second. I think it's the first or second most. It's the number 1 search engine. I think it's the second most traffic website on the entire internet after Google.com, and of course it's owned by Google. So even though Google, YouTube, and Facebook and Instagram are larger by size than Twitter, Twitter is unique in that every Twitter user is a Twitter content producer because of the retweet button. The vast majority of people who use YouTube, 99% of people who use YouTube aren't YouTube content creators. And Facebook and Meta are not really, there are political groups on Facebook, but for the most part, they're used for personal rather than political, groups aside, but all of Twitter is effectively this kind of, political thought leadership capacity. And this is where narratives tend to form, where things tend to go viral in terms of news cycles. And the fact that Elon Musk has at great cost to himself, rejected at every turn government infiltration, the Twitter files exposure of all the government folks, putting his arms out, suing various governments, like he sued Australia, he sued the Biden administration, to resist giving up things that the FBI had asked for, and to resist censorship demands from foreign countries. And the fact that there is free speech on X is, it's like a hole in the Titanic. It's very hard to contain if there's one hole, no matter how big the complex is. If you have 600 million people who can talk about something, that's absolutely huge. And then, because then people can then start to talk about things on Facebook and YouTube, and it gets harder to police that because they heard about it on X and are spreading it there. But if there was no X, they wouldn't have even heard about it. So these narratives wouldn't exist on these other platforms. And so I think what they've turned to now is this lawfare tactic, as they're using, legal defamation suits. They're using federal, they're using indictments at the state level and at the federal level, like Trump's, 98, 91 felony charges and things like this. And getting back to the rigging issue is they've really made an example of the lawyers who challenged election fraud in the last election cycle. Almost all of Trump's lawyers have been arrested or have been pierced their attorney-client privilege with their clients, and have been tried to turn by our federal intelligence state to be witnesses against their own clients, which means people who litigate issues of election fraud are getting disbarred. Famously, John Eastman is a sort of high-profile, one of the most prestigious election integrity lawyers in the United States. brilliant guy, amazing reputation. He lost his license to practice law in the state of California. He was disbarred because he brought an election fraud lawsuit. The same thing happened to Rudy Giuliani. He was disbarred in the state of New York for bringing an election fraud lawsuit because it was declared to be a frivolous lawsuit. They said, we're predetermining that there was no fraud. Doesn't matter what evidence you show me. And in fact, it was frivolous and knowingly, deliberately frivolous and malicious for you to bring that suit so you can no longer practice as a lawyer. It's like stripping doctors of their ability to practice medicine if they don't recommend a COVID vaccine. So they've done that to, 20 of Trump's lawyers. They've gotten rolled up in these RICO cases, treating them like the same racketeering type charges they used on Al Capone and the Chicago, super mob outfit. And so the issue is now, the censorship one was very important in 2020 because that is what allowed the use of mass mail-in ballots, because you couldn't challenge it politically because you couldn't talk about it without losing your Facebook, your Twitter, your YouTube, and it would all go for naught. Media wouldn't even pick up on it because, to post an article about that on your social media page means now you as a media organization, lose your account. So the whole thing was now in this.
I used the word rigged earlier, and I didn't mean it necessarily. I didn't mean it that they were ballot rigs. I mean it more in the manipulation in the censorship, and that's that kind of sense, which I think is what you're alluding to as well.
But the issue is, with what you mentioned with the use of illegal immigrants effectively being allowed to vote, or at least their votes counting through a process in which people who are committing a crime coming into this country, into the United States illegally, effectively being registered to vote through NGOs and through welfare offices and various things, and then having the NGOs simply fill out their ballots for them, is absolutely election rigging. And it's one of those things where the process of discovering malfeasance by NGOs who do that, or ballot harvesters who do that, is, could occur post-election. It's hard to catch people in the act for that, but the act of challenging it, is effectively a federal crime now. So we're in a slightly different situation in 2020, where we could have maybe stopped the use of mass mail-in ballots at the state level by having state legislators be responsive to these social media narratives going viral. Now, social media narratives can go viral, but we have a level above censorship, which is rule of law itself. The fact that they have weaponized rule of law, the censorship issue almost presupposes that you have a functioning legal system to litigate these issues in the first place. And I don't think that the United States has that anymore. I think all these cases against Donald Trump are completely illegitimate. 250 years, we've never indicted a president. We've never even had an FBI raid of a president. And all four of these are done by Soros-funded prosecutors. All four of these are done with novel legal theories. Some of these, like this one in New York, they had to have the state legislature effectively go in and change the statute of limitations to retroactively bring it. The whole thing was rigged up to the gills just to bend the rule of law, to bring, so that to make sure justice was not blind. And if you're going to arrest a president for the first time in United States history and go after, it better be it can't be a novel legal theory. I mean, that is so transparently political rather than blind. And so we have a different issue this time, which is the head of our Justice Department is a profoundly, corrupt individual. It's Merrick Garland is essentially protecting identical crimes that Biden, as a special prosecutor found in his own determination that President Biden willfully mishandled classified documents, but then said, we're not going to bring the suit because we think a jury might think that he's just a senile old man. So committed the same crime, did it knowingly, but, a DC jury might take it easy on him. So because of that, we're just not going to bring the case. That's the difference between skating free and 1,000 years in prison. A totally subjective, they're doing the same thing with Hunter Biden. The CIA waved the Justice Department off of interrogating, Hunter Biden's, sugar daddy, this lawyer who paid Hunter Biden's taxes for 5 years. The whole thing is rotten. But we're now at a level where censorship is still absolutely a huge issue. But we're now at the level of whether the Western world has rule of law itself. And that, I think, will ultimately define this upcoming election.
It's a bleak picture that you paint, but maybe it's one that we need to wake up to a little bit. Mike, we've covered a huge amount of ground there, and I'm sure in any of those topics we could have gone even deeper. Your mind is a deep well of information and very intriguing. And thank you for taking the time to speak with me. Is there anything you felt like you wanted to address or clear up before we bring it to the conversation?
Well, I wanted to ask your thoughts on the populism issue and where things go from here. And I heard your brilliant talks on this. And can I ask, hearing what I've all just kind of spat out here over the course of this, can I ask for your insights from your sort of view of the populism landscape about how that all plays into the censorship issues and the rule of law issues and the other sort of meta-political ones we touched on?
My general opinion is that there's been a worldview post-war, anti-nation statism. And maybe it's different in Europe to what happened in America, but there was a big reaction against, after what the Germans did, there's a big reaction against nationalism. In fact, curiously, I looked up the word nationalism in the dictionary recently, and the Oxford English Dictionary defines it as national interest, especially at the detriment of other nations, which is very curious. But if you're to take that definition of nationalism, then we're missing a word for being in favor of your own country and also allowing other countries to be in favor of themselves.
Can I add one thing really quickly? Because I would love to hear your take on this. If and what you've already sort of accumulated and been speaking about with an adjacent phrase, which was used very heavily in NATO periodicals and in these NATO thought leadership magazines like the Journal of Democracy and these others. And it was a concept called sovereigntism, which I think fits that category of what you're talking about, which is like nationalism.
Yeah, exactly.
But it was a slur word. They use sovereigntism as a slur. Which is, and you can look this up, and I'm curious, for your takes later in time on how the idea of sovereigntism itself is actually anti-democratic.
Exactly, that's astonishing. Well, part of I wonder if this, and I'm still formulating my opinions here, but democracy. There's a conception in Europe that democracy meant that evil parties and people were elected. So there's a fear of democracy, there's a fear of the people, that particularly after what happened in Germany. So after the war, then you have this world order where a lot of people reject all of nationalism, even patriotism, any love of state. And I think it's different in America, but this happened in Europe, and they embraced globalization.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've now had is, I guess after half a century of pushing globalization, and the leaders of that movement, or the political leaders in charge, completely ignoring all the downsides of globalization, i.e. how mass migration hurts working classes, how you said it yourself in this conversation, how it affects social cohesion, the obvious crime involved. There's so many downsides. Now you can make the case for mass migration, and there's good sides. There's good arguments for migration, but you cannot have that conversation without at least talking about the negative sides. It has now become completely politically incorrect to even discuss the negative sides, and so the populist movement that we're seeing, I think, in certainly in Europe, but there's a version in South America, there's a version in your country, is against that. Is a movement towards nation statism. I'll make something that I'm concerned about, though, despite that, which is, and I made this prediction about a year ago, is that words like far-right, Nazi and fascist have been so used and abused that if there was to be a far-right that emerges, no one will believe you anymore.
What would you call it?
And that's my sort of concern. And it is the case that if you, let's say, read the Alternative for Deutschland manifesto, it's a conservative manifesto, but then there are people associated with that party who are Nazi adjacent. Right. And so we're getting into this territory where people are going to ignore that because they just don't believe it anymore, right. Because that's the classic slur. But I see it generally as the people are fed up with the technocrats because technocracy has not worked for the ordinary people, for the left behind. You have the Rust Belt in America. We have the Red Wall, for example. There's all these communities that have been overlooked and severely damaged by neoliberalism, by globalization, and so that's the response we're seeing. And then we have I think you met Silke Carlo, who spoke at this conference we were both at a couple of days ago, and she says that censorship is not to protect the truth. Censorship is to protect power. So you have this elite group with this worldview, this sense of how things should be, who have avoided appeasing any of the moderate demands of local communities, of the people, of ordinary people, and they want to retain their power. These people want to retain their power, which is why they're putting these things, and they basically have a disdain and contempt for ordinary people. That's a kind of small ally of how I see things are going, and populism is a topic that I've been covering a lot on this podcast and interviewing lots of people.
Yeah, no, that's I agree with that 100%.
That must be something going on in the States, because immigration is a big part of it. We've spent most of this conversation talking about foreign policy. I'm not sure if the regular voter cares that much about foreign policy. Right. I'm not sure how high up. It's basically economics would be probably top of the list, and immigration and culture. These are the important things.
Right.
That's a difference also between right populists and left populists. Right populists lean on culture, left populists emphasize economics. It's not an accident that a quarter of those who supported Bernie did not support Hillary, and of those, half supported Trump, because they recognize the same problems of globalization, and it's hurting the working people.
Right.
So that's my thinking isn't quite as sophisticated as yours has been, in going into all this, what's going on underneath the hood, which is kind of why I was interested to hear where your explorations have taken you.
Well, what's really interesting is the issue is personnel is policy. So I totally agree that most voters don't care about foreign policy. They care about what's happening on their street corner. They care about how safe, their streets are, how well performing their schools are, whether they can buy a home or afford, their bills and things like this. But the president that you vote for is going to have a foreign policy agenda. And if that foreign policy agenda is opposed by the blob, the foreign policy establishment, then they will take action to destroy that person, regardless of the domestic. So you may be supporting someone because of domestic policy for president, but they will be destroyed by the machinery of this, through the legal system, through the intelligence services, through all the different ways, the media slander, because of their foreign policy, and that will stop you from achieving any sort of victory on the domestic policy thing, because that person will be destroyed. And I think an interesting example of this is we had the governor of our state of Florida in the U.S. is Ron DeSantis, who is a person who I think has not really been slandered in the media. There has been attempts to, because he was very COVID critical. He opposed the COVID orthodoxy. He kicked wokeism out of school. He banned DEI. He went after Disney for their LGBT activism stuff. Took action on a ton of different domestic issues. But on foreign policy, he is with the blob on giving the money to Ukraine. And, he got a huge amount of money and institutional support in running against Trump. And I don't think that he would be indicted on 91 felonies for random charges. I don't think he would be impeached. I think that the blob would allow him to accumulate certain victories against on the domestic issue, as long as they get their cut, preserved on all of these international and global issues. And so there is this sort of delicate dance right now as populism becomes more and more institutionalized within the conception of Western conservatism, both in the U.S., because it was a very new thing in 2016 for us in the U.S., and I think maybe 2013-ish, when the sort of initial Europe migrant crisis maybe kicked off and started giving I think it started in Europe a little bit before it started with us in the U.S., but it has now had almost 10 years of maturation, and it's now half of our Congress is populist. But there is this question about
half of the Republican Party.
Yes, right, half of the Republican Party. But it's one of these things where there is where populism will ultimately fall in that dance with, sort of the traditional establishment globalist lens through which to understand conservatism and the whole, free markets, because this is another thing is Bernie Sanders on the open borders thing. Bernie Sanders was our left-wing socialist, communist. A lot of people were saying, Democrat candidate who almost defeated Hillary Clinton for the Democrat Party election in nomination in 2016. He was asked in 2015 by a news organization if he agrees with open borders. And he laughed at the reporter and said, no, open borders, that's a right-wing proposal. That's a Koch brothers. The Koch brothers are these major industrialists that support the Republican Party. And he said, because open borders destroys union power, it kills worker wages, it is a right-wing economic policy.
He's a National Socialist.
Yeah, so now we get back to that debate where they left, where they right.
No, but he's right. And by the way, I don't think you can have liberalism without controlled borders.
Right.
So maybe I would say I'm a national liberal.
Right.
I don't think you can really have you can't have any political system without control of your borders. It's fundamental.
You should coin that phrase, national liberal.
Well, yeah, but I mean, even liberal is now a dirty word. You can't say that. I desperately try and cling on to the word because I still hold dear those classical liberal tenets.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Bernie's a National Socialist. That's
yeah, I guess so. But it's one of these things where I do think if they get their cut, you might be able to control some of these things. But whether or not, going back to the original question, can Trump change any of this? It gets back to this dance of how far are they willing to go to destroy him? How far are they willing to go to destroy Marine Le Pen in France and the Reform Party in the UK and the Vox Party in Spain and Meloni's now movement in Italy and there's going to be this constant evolutionary arms race between how much punishment they can dole out and sustain, how resilient these movements are to that persecution, and how much institutionalization, over time takes root. And it may be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. In a lot of ways, it may be a lot of compromise. Trump may decide that he needs to put in a blob vice president in order to send a signal to the Justice Department. You don't need to throw me in prison necessarily because you'll get your cut on certain things, but I'll get another Supreme Court judge and you'll keep getting Ukraine funding. Like he basically signaled by lending his support to structuring the Ukraine aid as not as a payment, but as a non-repayable, no interest loan. It's like these little things where he's sort of signaling to the base that he's.
Oh, has he already said that?
Yeah, but I mean, it's substantively, it's the same thing as giving it to them. I mean, they don't, no interest.
He also says he's going to end the conflict on day one.
Right.
He wants to make the deal.
Right.
So I guess he's just saying whatever he needs to say to whoever he needs to hear it.
That may be true. At the same time, he may believe that he can bring these parties to the table, and frankly, he may be able to. I think a lot of the reason that Putin did what he did was because Biden put them up against the wall. That Biden, massively upscaled the military backing for the the Kiev reconquest of those breakaway states in the Donbass. They impeached Trump for even thinking about withholding Ukraine military aid in 2019. If you remember, there was the phone call to Zelensky in 2019, and Biden went all in on that. I think Putin felt threatened. I think he did what he did because he felt like a cornered animal because of what the Biden administration was doing. And I think that's the same thing. I think that Israel is doing what it's doing in Gaza because it feels like a cornered animal because of how aggressive the Biden administration has been. I think that Saudi Arabia is now all but, formally joining BRICS, because they feel cornered by the extreme foreign policy of the Biden administration. And so I think one by one, all of these countries are doing this because they don't know if Bidenism is going to last for 50 more years in the United States. They see the guy who's beating Trump in the polls about to, maybe be wasting away in Rikers Island, in a federal prison, on an island off of New York City, for trying to challenge the country. So they are looking at the United States as maybe having 100 years of darkness, and they need to do whatever they need to do because of how far the U.S. might go. So, but that could change depending on how many concessions Trump signals he's willing to make, but that will upset his populist base. So it's a delicate tango dance, but it's going to be a hell of a movie.
It's going to be a hell of a movie, and it all kicks off with the debates, which are at the end of this week.
Yes.
Mike, great to speak to you. You mentioned earlier your Twitter, but where can people find Mike Benz online or out in the wild?
Yep, it's at Mike Benz Cyber, all one word, Mike Benz Cyber, at Mike Benz Cyber on X. Also, my Foundation for Freedom Online, it's foundationforfreedomonline.com. We have cutting-edge investigative journalism and reports on the activities of the censorship industry, so you can go there as well. Yes, I post very frequently, so you can find all my takes there.
Mike Benz, a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.